My stepfather smirked and barked, "Pack your bags, this house is mine now." I locked the front door behind me and replied, "Go ahead, the sheriff already knows who's trespassing." I was coming back from the grocery store with 2 heavy bags and a paper carton of eggs balanced on top when I saw the moving truck in my driveway. At first, I thought I had the wrong house. Then I saw the open side gate, the sagging tarp over the porch furniture, and my stepfather's silver truck angled half across the lawn like he owned the place. I had lived in that house for almost 6 years by then, and that one look at the driveway made my stomach drop in a way I still remember perfectly. My mother had been gone for 4 months. The grief had not even settled into something livable yet, and here he was, acting like the house was already his. I had been helping my mother with everything during her illness, and after she died, I stayed because she had asked me to keep the place together until the estate lawyer sorted things out. I figured that meant paperwork, bills, maybe some arguments with my stepfather, because arguments were his favorite hobby. I did not think it would turn into a fight over the roof over my head. My mother's name had been on that house since before she married him. She had bought it after my grandfather died and used the insurance money and a small inheritance from her own mother to put down the first payment. It was not fancy. It was a plain 3-bedroom ranch in a neighborhood where every second house had a chain-link fence and a cracked driveway. But it was hers. She planted the rose bush by the front steps. She painted the kitchen pale yellow because she said the room looked less depressing in yellow. She paid the property taxes, the insurance, and every mortgage payment for the first 10 years before the mortgage was finally paid off. My stepfather liked to tell people later that he had helped build the house up. That was one of his many ways of rewriting reality. His name was Carl. He came into our lives when I was 16 and still angry about the way my father died. My dad had been the kind of steady man who showed up with tools in the trunk and extra money folded in his wallet for emergencies. He was not perfect, but he was mine. When he died in a work accident, my mother spent a long time looking tired in a way I did not understand back then. I think Carl noticed that. He also noticed that my mother had a house, a job, and 2 teenagers who were not going to disappear just because he walked in with a polite smile and a decent tie. He was charming in the beginning. He brought groceries without being asked. He fixed the leaky faucet in the hall bathroom. He acted like he respected our space. I remember thinking he seemed almost too eager to help, but I was young and my mother was lonely, and he looked like the kind of man who knew how to stand in a room and make it feel less empty. It took years for the mask to slip, not all at once. That was the part that made it harder to explain later. He was never one giant explosion of evil. He was 1,000 little pushes. A comment about how the house would be easier to manage if his name was on things. A joke about how he was practically raising us so he should get a say in everything. A constant need to be acknowledged for whatever he did, even if my mother had asked him 3 times before he finally did it. He liked to be praised for ordinary chores. He liked to talk about our money when the money came from my mother's paycheck. He liked to remind me that he was the man of the house, which was funny because the only reason he ever had a house was because my mother brought one into the marriage. He never hit anyone. He was not the kind of villain who left obvious bruises. He was the kind who made everything muddy enough that you doubted your own memory. When my mother got sick, the whole dynamic shifted in a way that should have warned me. Her diagnosis came after a routine appointment she almost skipped because she was too busy at work. The first round of tests turned into the second. Then the biopsy, then the surgery, then the chemo schedule that ate up our calendar. I started going with her to appointments when I could get time off work. My sister lived out of state and called often, but I was the one in the waiting rooms with her, the one taking notes, the one driving home with the smell of hospital sanitizer stuck in my jacket. Carl was there too, but in a way that felt performative. He would hover in the doorways and bring coffee and talk too much to nurses without remembering their names afterward. He wanted credit for being present. He did not want the actual burden of being useful. During one of the late treatments, when my mother was exhausted and the nausea had made her shake, she asked me to get her a binder from the bottom drawer of her nightstand. Inside were copies of her will, the mortgage payoff letter, the deed records, insurance policies, and a few pages clipped together. With a note in her handwriting, she told me to keep the folder in my room for now. She said not to let Carl handle it. I remember being surprised by how flat her voice was when she said that. It was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was tired. When I asked her why, she just looked at me and said she was not taking chances anymore. I did not press her then. That was one of the many things I look back on and wish I had handled differently. I thought she was scared of paperwork and confusion and the general chaos of being sick. I did not realize she was scared of him. Maybe she was not scared in the way people mean that word. Maybe she just knew him better than I did. The first real crack showed up in small financial things. Carl started asking questions about the mortgage even though it had been paid off years earlier. He wanted to know if the house could be leveraged. He used that word a lot. He also asked if my mother had ever considered putting him on the deed so the house would stay in the family. My mother said no every time, but she said it in the calm voice she used when she was too tired to argue. I think she wanted peace more than she wanted victory while she was still alive. That should have told me something too. She was making a lot of quiet decisions without telling him. After she died, he changed. Not in one sharp move, in a series of increasingly obvious turns. He started rearranging her things before the funeral flowers had even wilted. He emptied her side of the closet and stacked the clothes in black garbage bags. He boxed up framed photos and labeled the boxes with marker like he was clearing out a storage unit. I found one of her sweaters shoved into a donation pile by the garage, and it made me so angry I had to leave the room. He said he needed to make space. He said the house felt crowded. He said grief made people cling to things they did not need. He said all of it with the tone of someone explaining basic math to a child. I tried to stay out of his way. I really did. I was working full-time, handling calls from the funeral home, checking in on bills, and meeting with the estate lawyer my mother had named. The lawyer, a quiet woman named Miss Dorsey, told me the estate was straightforward on paper but could become messy if anyone started fighting over the house. That sentence landed in me like a warning bell. I asked her directly whether Carl had any ownership claim. She said no, not from what she had seen in the file. The house had belonged to my mother outright before the marriage. There was also a recorded transfer on death deed naming me as the beneficiary. I had to ask her to repeat that because I honestly thought I had misheard. She said my mother had arranged it 6 months before she died. She also said my mother had left a letter explaining why. I did not read that letter immediately. I was not ready. I knew it existed, but I put it back in the folder and sat with my back against the kitchen counter for probably 10 minutes without moving. The transfer on death deed was the first thing that made the whole situation feel real in a legal way. Before that, Carl had been acting as if volume could replace ownership. After that, I knew he was going to become difficult. He noticed my mood had changed. He noticed because men like him always notice when control starts slipping. A few nights after the funeral, he asked whether I had talked to the lawyer yet. When I told him I had, he acted like he was curious, but I could hear the tension in how fast he asked the next question. He wanted to know whether the house was going into probate. He wanted to know whether he could stay there temporarily until everything got sorted. He wanted to know whether my mother had left any instructions about the bills. I answered carefully. I said the lawyer was handling things. I said I was not changing anything without advice. I said the house was not being sold. That seemed to irritate him more than I expected. He had built some fantasy in his head where grief made people easy to pressure. He had probably assumed I would be too sad or too disorganized to push back. The funny thing is, I was sad and disorganized. I just kept records anyway. My mother had taught me that without meaning to. She kept every receipt for anything bigger than $50. She had a little accordion folder for appliance warranties, insurance renewals, and tax documents. When I was a teenager, I thought she was being obsessive. When I was an adult, I realized she was being smart, so I copied everything I could. I scanned the deed, the will, the utility bills, the tax receipts, the insurance records, and the bank statements related to the house. I backed up the files to 2 places. I put the originals in a fireproof box in my room. At the time, I thought I was just being cautious. Later, it turned out to be the only reason I did not end up trapped in a much uglier mess. The first direct confrontation happened over the garage. My mother had used the detached garage as storage for years. It was full of old Christmas decorations, garden tools, paint cans, spare tiles from the kitchen remodel, and a stack of furniture she had been meaning to donate. Carl decided he wanted to clear it out because, in his words, he needed a better place to work. He did not ask me. He told me after he had already moved his workbench into one side of it. I told him the garage was full of my mother's things, and I was not moving any of it until I went through it with my sister. He rolled his eyes and said I was making everything harder than it had to be. I told him I was the one handling the estate. He said that was a pretty attitude for someone living in his house. That was the first time I laughed, and it was not because anything was funny. I laughed because the claim was so ridiculous that my brain honestly had to process it as a joke for half a second. He stared at me like I had insulted him. I told him the house was not his. He told me he had been married to my mother for over a decade, and that counted for more than I thought. I told him the lawyer would sort it out. He told me lawyers always made things messy. Then he said I should remember who had been there for the family when it mattered. That was classic Carl. He always framed his wants as sacrifice. The next week he started leaving things in my room, not all at once, just enough to signal a boundary test. A box on my dresser, a stack of his tax papers on my chair, a note on the hallway table telling me not to use the dryer after 9 because it made too much noise. I took pictures of all of it, partly because I was angry and partly because I had learned that anger without evidence was useless against men like him. When I told Miss Dorsey about the behavior, she suggested I keep a log. Time, date, what happened, whether there were witnesses. I started doing it in a notebook I kept in my truck. It felt silly at first. It did not feel silly later when it became clear he was building his own little narrative about me being difficult. 2 weeks after the funeral, I found out he had already started talking to relatives as if the house belonged to him. My aunt called me, confused and upset, because Carl had told her he intended to keep the place and let me stay as long as I was respectful. He presented this like a generous offer. He had also implied that my mother had verbally promised him the house because he had taken care of her during treatment. I nearly dropped my phone when I heard that. My aunt knew my mother too well for the story to land cleanly, and she asked me directly whether that was true. It was not. My mother had thanked him for driving her to one appointment when I was working late, but she had never promised him anything. My aunt then got quiet in a way that told me she had already suspected he was exaggerating. She told me my mother had mentioned several times over the years that Carl liked to confuse being married with being entitled. That conversation made me go back to the folder my mother had left me. I finally opened the letter. It was only 2 pages long, which somehow made it hit harder. She wrote that she knew Carl would push after she was gone. She wrote that he liked to treat her patience as weakness. She wrote that she had left the house to me because she knew I would keep it, maintain it, and not let him sell it out from under everyone. She also wrote that she had kept a separate checking account for the last 3 years because she had found out he was borrowing from their joint funds to cover his own credit card debt. She apologized for not telling me sooner. That part almost made me cry all over again. My mother had been carrying that alone while she was sick. Carl had not just been difficult. He had been actively draining money from the same household he kept claiming to protect. I brought that letter to Miss Dorsey the next morning. She was not surprised. That was the first time I understood she had probably seen this kind of thing before. She asked me whether my mother had ever mentioned a safe deposit box. I said yes once, but I had never paid attention. That turned into another errand, another file, another layer of the story. In the box were copies of the deed transfer, bank records, a statement from her financial advisor, and a list of notes she had made about big repairs over the years. Roof replacement, water heater, foundation patch. Every time Carl later boasted that he had paid for something major in the house, the paper trail showed my mother had paid for it. He had been involved in the labor on a few projects, yes. He had not been financing anything. The first time I saw the transfer on death deed recorded with the county seal on it, I felt something loosen in my chest. I had been carrying the house in my head as a giant uncertainty. There was always this fear that I was missing some hidden clause, some old promise, some legal angle he could twist into ownership if he was loud enough. But the deed was clear. It named me. It was signed and notarized and recorded before my mother died. That mattered. It meant she had not just hoped I would get the house. She had made it happen. I still did not think the fight would become as ugly as it did. I underestimated Carl for the same reason a lot of people do. He was lazy in obvious ways, but relentless in strategic ones. He did not build things. He wore people down. For about a month, he acted like the conflict was mostly emotional. He would complain about family loyalty. He would make pointed remarks about how my mother would be disappointed if she saw us fighting. He would tell me he had nowhere else to go. He would tell me I was forcing a widower out of his home. He used that word widower like a shield. He knew exactly what it was supposed to do to people. He knew most people would instinctively feel sorry for a man who had lost his wife. What they did not see was that he was using grief as camouflage. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in early June. I had worked late and stopped for groceries on the way back. The moving truck was back. This time there were 2 strangers carrying boxes from the hallway into the living room. One of them had already stacked my mother's old cedar chest near the front window. Carl was standing in the doorway of the kitchen with his arms folded, looking satisfied. He told me he had found a place and was taking what he needed now before I made a scene. I told him to stop. He said the place was half his by marriage. I told him he had no deed. He said he had rights. He said my mother would have wanted him comfortable. He said I was young enough to recover from a little inconvenience. That was the moment I stopped trying to argue with his version of reality and started thinking like my mother. While he was talking to the movers, I stepped into the hallway, locked the front door behind me, and checked my phone. I had already spoken to the sheriff's office that afternoon, not because I expected a dramatic arrest, because Miss Dorsey had told me that once someone started physically removing belongings and bringing outside workers onto the property, I needed a formal record. I had filed a trespass warning after Carl ignored my written notice, not to enter my room or remove items from the house without permission. The deputy on duty had told me the warning would be on file. He also told me to call back if Carl refused to leave. I did not expect things to happen this fast, but I was glad I had made the call. Carl looked at me like I had just pulled a cheap trick. Then he smirked in that irritating, confident way he had when he thought he had more power than the room. He barked that I should pack my bags because this house was his now. I remember how calm I felt in that exact second. Not peaceful, just very, very clear. I told him to go ahead. I told him the sheriff already knew who was trespassing. I watched his expression change. It was not fear right away. It was irritation at being interrupted. He thought I was bluffing. He was wrong. The sheriff arrived less than 20 minutes later. By then the movers had stopped carrying boxes and were hovering near the truck like they wanted to be anywhere else. Carl tried to present the whole thing as a family dispute. He said I was being emotional. He said I did not understand the arrangement. He said he had been living there and had every right to continue living there. The deputy, who was older and had the kind of face that suggested he had seen every domestic lie in the county, asked him whether he was on the deed or had a lease. Carl hesitated just long enough for me to know he was already in trouble. Then he said he did not have the papers on him. The deputy asked whether he owned the house. Carl said he was married to the owner. That was when the deputy turned to me and asked for documentation. I handed over the deed first, then the death certificate, then the letter from the estate lawyer, then the trespass warning receipt, then the copy of my mother's recorded transfer on death deed. The deputy reads slower after each page. I could see the moment the situation stopped looking like a personal argument and started looking like what it was. Carl had no ownership claim. He did not even have the paperwork to pretend convincingly. He tried to protest that paperwork could be manipulated. The deputy told him the county recorder would disagree. That line still makes me want to smile because it was so dry and so perfectly timed. The movers were dismissed after that. They left quickly. Carl stayed long enough to keep trying different angles. He said the house should be split because he had lived there for years. He said he had paid for upkeep. He said he had thrown himself into caring for my mother. He said I was taking advantage of his grief. The deputy, bless him, asked him whether he wanted to make a formal statement or whether he wanted to speak to the lawyer instead. Carl chose neither. He kept saying he needed time. The deputy told him he could gather essential personal items under supervision, but he was not to remove anything owned by the estate, and he was not to continue claiming the property as his own. That was the first time I saw him lose the edge of his confidence in real time. It did not disappear all at once. It cracked, and once it cracked, all the ugliness underneath became harder for him to hide. I expected him to yell at me after the deputy left. He did not. He went very quiet. That was almost worse. He packed 2 suitcases, his medication, his laptop, and a box of paperwork that I later learned was mostly his own debt notices. Then he left to stay with his brother across town. For about 12 hours, I thought that might be the end of it. It was not. It was just the beginning of the part where he tried to punish me for not folding. The next morning, I got a text from my cousin saying Carl was telling people I had stolen my mother's house from him. By noon, I had 3 more messages. One relative believed him. One did not. One wanted to know whether the house was even legally in my name yet. I forwarded the deed paperwork to Miss Dorsey and let her handle the official response. That was another lesson. My mother had drilled into me without meaning to. Do not argue with a liar unless the lie can be answered with a document. So I stopped arguing. I started sending files. Miss Dorsey confirmed the transfer on death deed had executed properly the moment my mother died. She also explained that while Carl might have tenant rights depending on state rules and how long he had lived there after my mother's death, he did not have any right to declare ownership or remove property without authority. That meant he could not treat the house like a movable prize in the middle of the night. It also meant his attempt to clear it out with movers and claim it was his had crossed into ugly legal territory. She recommended a formal notice, followed by a proper eviction process if he refused to leave permanently. That part felt almost absurdly civilized after what had already happened. I had imagined law would be louder. Instead, it was mostly paper, deadlines, and signatures. Apparently, that was enough if you had the right paper. Carl did not like being told no in writing. He called me twice from his brother's number. I did not answer. He emailed Miss Dorsey demanding a copy of all marital property documents. She replied with a list of what he was and was not entitled to review. He showed up at the house once that week with a duffel bag and a face full of insult, then left when he realized I had a camera on the porch and a note from the sheriff taped to the door. That was the second most satisfying moment of the whole thing. The first had been locking the door behind me. The camera had been my idea after the first trespass warning. I bought it that same night, installed it the next morning, and made sure it covered the driveway, front steps, and side gate. My mother would have hated that I needed it. She would also have been glad I had it. The part that really exposed him came from his own carelessness. He had spent years treating the house like invisible background scenery in his personal story. Because of that, he left things lying around. A credit card statement in the kitchen drawer, a collection notice on the hall table, an old folder in the garage with his name on it, and a refinancing quote that had my mother's house address on the top. I found out he had been trying for almost a year before she died to convince a lender to let him take out a home equity loan. He never got it because the house was not in his name. He had apparently still told people he planned to use the house to cover a few debts. That was the kind of detail that changed how his story looked. Suddenly, all those comments about leveraging the property were not random. They were a plan, a bad one, but still a plan. I showed the loan application to Miss Dorsey. She stared at it for a long second and then asked me whether my mother knew about it. I said I did not know, so I checked the dates. The application had been submitted while my mother was already in treatment. That mattered to me in a way I struggled to put into words. He had been trying to borrow against her house while she was sick. Maybe he thought she would not notice. Maybe he thought she would be too weak to care. Either way, he had been willing to gamble with the roof over her head to cover his own debt. That was the moment I stopped feeling anything close to sympathy for him. I told my sister everything on a video call that weekend. She had been trying to keep distance because she lived 2 states away and had a toddler and a job that did not allow her to fly out every time a family mess exploded. When I walked her through the documents, she got quiet in a way that meant she was angry but trying not to say too much in front of her kid. She told me our mother had once hinted that Carl was getting sloppy with money. She had not known it was this bad. She apologized for not being here. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. That was not true in the emotional sense, but it was true in the practical one. I had the documents, I had the footage, I had the lawyer. I had the patience to let the process do its work. That was enough. The legal part took longer than the emotional part, which I did not expect. People always imagine a clean, dramatic cutoff, but the real thing drags. Carl's brother tried to mediate for about a week. He said Carl was embarrassed and grief-stricken and just needed time. I told him grief did not create ownership. He did not argue with that. Then Carl's daughter from his first marriage called my sister and asked whether I was really forcing him out. That conversation turned ugly fast once my sister explained the deed and the trespass warning. She had not even known there was a daughter from the first marriage involved. Apparently, Carl had not mentioned her much either. That turned out to matter because she was the one person in his circle who seemed to understand that if a man tells the same lie to everybody, the lie eventually collapses under its own weight. About 3 weeks after the confrontation with the movers, Miss Dorsey sent him a formal notice to vacate. He ignored it. Then he tried to come back and change the locks. He brought a locksmith with him. The locksmith, to his credit, called the sheriff's office when he realized the paperwork did not match the ownership claim Carl had made. I was at work when the deputy called me to say Carl was on the property again. I nearly had to pull over on the way home because I was so furious my hands were shaking. By the time I got there, Carl was standing in the driveway arguing with the deputy over whether marital rights gave him more time. The deputy told him to look at the deed again. Carl said the deed could have been manipulated. The deputy said he could take that up with the court, not the front door. That was the first time he looked genuinely cornered. Not because he was physically threatened, because every shortcut he had relied on was gone. No bluff, no guilt trip, no performance about being the grieving husband. Just record after record saying the same thing. He was not the owner. He was not the decision maker. He was not even the person withstanding to keep standing in the driveway and pretending otherwise. When the deputy told him he needed to leave and continue the dispute through legal channels, Carl snapped. He finally let the anger show. He said I had poisoned my mother against him. He said I had always wanted him gone. He said I was using a dead woman to humiliate him. That part landed hard because it was the closest he had come to saying the truth, even though he obviously meant it as an accusation. I had wanted him gone, just not like this. I had wanted him gone because he was cruel when nobody was looking. I had wanted him gone because my mother had spent the last years of her life shrinking herself around his moods. I had wanted him gone because he thought a legal fiction was stronger than a recorded deed. I did not yell. I just handed the deputy the updated notice Miss Dorsey had prepared, along with the footage from the camera and the locksmith's name. The deputy took notes. Carl saw me doing it and realized, finally, that I was not improvising. I had been building a record the whole time. He left before the deputy finished writing. This time he did not take anything besides his own car keys and a folder of mail. That felt like a tiny victory, but it also made me sad in a strange way. It meant this man had spent more than a decade in my mother's house and had left with less dignity than a repairman who forgot his ladder. The eviction process was not glamorous. It was tedious. It was forms and service dates and waiting periods and a hearing that lasted less than 20 minutes because the documents were so clean. Carl finally hired a lawyer of his own, which should have made him more careful. Instead, it made him louder for about a week. His lawyer requested proof of the transfer on death deed, proof of mailing, proof of notice, proof of the estate inventory, proof of the property tax status, proof of utilities, proof of any contribution to the house. We had all of it. My mother had been meticulous. If she had known how much I would lean on those records later, she probably would have laughed in that dry way she had. The judge looked through the packet, confirmed the county records, and set a move-out deadline. That was it. No grand speech, no dramatic exposure, just the kind of quiet ruling that makes a liar look much smaller than he sounded in the driveway. Carl tried one last angle after that. He sent me a long message through his brother's phone saying he had been part of my mother's life, that he had loved her, and that I was disrespecting her memory by treating him like a criminal. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Miss Dorsey and deleted it. The truth was he probably did love my mother in the limited way he was capable of loving anyone. I'm not even sure how to explain that without sounding like I am making excuses for him. I think he loved being needed. I think he loved the status of being her husband. I think he loved the comfort of her house and the appearance of stability. I do not think he loved her enough to protect her interests when it cost him something. That distinction mattered more than any of his speeches. The most painful part for me was going through my mother's things after the court date. By then the house was legally mine, but it did not feel like a win yet. It felt like a place frozen in the middle of two lives. I spent weekends sorting through drawers, donation boxes, and stacks of old mail. I found her reading glasses in the junk drawer. I found grocery lists with little notes in the margins. I found a birthday card she had bought for me and never mailed because she got sick before she could sign it. I found a receipt for the safe deposit box and a folded list of passwords hidden inside a cookbook. Every item made the house feel more hers and less like the battleground Carl had tried to turn it into. There were also practical consequences that people never mention when they talk about winning an argument. I had to change the locks, update the insurance, notify the utility companies, and handle the taxes as the new owner. I had to pay a contractor to check the roof because a section had started to sag near the back porch. I had to open a separate account for the estate funds and learn more about property records than I ever wanted to know. For a while, I barely slept. Every time my phone buzzed, I expected another message from Carl or one of his relatives accusing me of something. Instead, I got appointment reminders, invoice emails, and one very polite note from the county recorder confirming the transfer had been filed correctly. That email looked boring. It felt like armor. My aunt came over one Sunday with 2 casseroles and a box of my mother's old photo albums. She had been through enough of the drama by then to stop asking polite questions. She sat at the kitchen table and told me my mother had once said she hoped I would have the strength to hold onto the house if Carl ever got difficult. That hurt more than I expected. It also made me grateful. My mother had not just hoped, she had prepared. She had left me the documents, the deed, the notes, the folder, and the clear path through the mess. She had known exactly what kind of man she was married to. She just had not had the energy to fight him while she was alive. That was something I had to sit with for a long time. Carl's side of the family reacted the way families usually do when one person's lies finally stop working. A few people stayed angry at me. They were mostly the ones who liked hearing his version because it made their lives simpler. A few stopped calling him. His daughter from the first marriage sent me a short message later saying she had checked her own records and was not surprised he had tried to pull a stunt like this. She also said she was sorry my mother had to put up with him as long as she did. That message mattered because it came from someone with no reason to flatter me. It made me feel less alone in the conclusion I had reached. Carl did eventually move out. He tried to stretch the deadline. He tried to leave behind some boxes and claim he would return for them later. Miss Dorsey had already warned me not to get dragged into side arguments. So I cataloged the boxes, had a neighbor witness the inventory, and arranged for a neutral pickup window. He came with his brother and 2 borrowed hand trucks, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He did not look defeated exactly. He looked offended by reality. That was probably the closest he got to accepting what had happened. He loaded his own things without speaking to me. I stood on the porch and watched until the truck pulled away. Then I sat on the front steps and cried for maybe 5 minutes because the adrenaline finally had somewhere to go. The house felt different after that. Not magically better, not suddenly healed, just quieter. I repainted the kitchen because the old yellow had faded unevenly over the years. I fixed the porch light. I replaced the lopsided mailbox my mother had complained about for ages. I planted the roses back out front, because the old bush was still alive under the weeds Carl had ignored. Every small repair felt like I was returning the place to the person who had actually loved it. I kept some of her furniture and donated the rest. I gave the cedar chest to my sister because she remembered sitting on it as a kid while my mother folded laundry. We argued briefly over who got the old dining set, and then laughed because my mother would have rolled her eyes at both of us. That was the first time the house felt like a home again instead of a file folder with walls. As for Carl, the consequences followed him in more ways than one. The property dispute exposed his debt, which I knew because his own paperwork had been part of the inventory. One of his credit card companies had been mailing notices to the old address for months. Apparently, he had been juggling balances and hoping to refinance something before anyone noticed. I did not go looking for revenge. I just forwarded what was necessary to the right people and let the rest happen. He lost the illusion of being able to use my mother's house as his backup plan. He also lost the ability to tell relatives that he had been unfairly pushed aside without somebody pulling out the deed and proving otherwise. The truth does not always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives as a county record number and a stack of unpaid notices. A few months later, one of my mother's friends from church stopped by with a pie and told me she had always worried about Carl. She said he had a way of speaking for my mother that never quite matched what she actually said. That comment stuck with me. It explained so much. He had not just wanted the house. He had wanted the version of my mother that made his story sound better. He wanted people to remember him as the man who protected her, not the man she quietly planned around. That was why he fought so hard after she died. Once she was gone, the paper trail was all that was left to speak for her. And the paper trail did not care how charming he was. I wish I could say I handled everything perfectly. I did not. I snapped at relatives. I ignored sleep. I spent too much on takeout during the worst weeks because I could not face cooking in the house where all this had happened. I also wasted time feeling guilty for not seeing him clearly sooner. But I did one thing right that mattered more than any of my mistakes. I listened when my mother started quietly preparing for the possibility that he would try something. She had been telling me in her own way that the man she married was not the man she wanted in charge of her life. I just needed the paperwork to understand how serious she was. The last time I saw Carl, I was at the post office changing the mailing address on the estate account. He was across the parking lot loading boxes into the back of his brother's truck. He saw me and froze for a second, like he might try to say something. Then he looked away. There was no big finale. No apology, no dramatic collapse, just a man who had run out of ways to pretend. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. I also felt relieved in a way I had not been able to feel since my mother died. People like to imagine that the reward for staying calm is some movie-style victory. Mine looked more like keeping the house, keeping my mother's things, and keeping my sanity. It looked like the sheriff telling Carl he was not the owner. It looked like the county records matching what my mother had planned. It looked like a judge reading a deed and making a very boring decision that happened to save me from losing everything. It looked like me walking through the front door after the last box left and hearing the house be quiet for the first time in months. I still live there. I fixed the roof. I replaced the broken garbage disposal. I kept my mother's little yellow kitchen because I could not bring myself to paint over it again. My sister visits more often now. We sit on the porch in the evenings and talk about ordinary things, groceries, kids, work, bills, the kind of boring conversations that feel like proof that life kept going. Every so often I pass the safe fireproof box in the hall closet and remember how close I came to being bullied out of a house my mother had spent her whole adult life protecting. Carl was wrong about a lot of things. He was wrong about who owned the house. He was wrong about how far charm would get him. He was wrong about how little attention I paid when I was quiet. And he was most wrong about this part. He thought I was too emotional to be strategic. He thought grief made people sloppy. What he did not understand was that my mother had taught me to keep records long before I knew why it mattered. That one habit, plus a calm voice and a locked front door, was enough to make his whole plan fall apart in front of a sheriff, a lawyer, and a stack of county documents that did not care how hard he smirked. So yeah, when he barked that the house was his now, I probably should have laughed. Instead, I locked the door, called his bluff, and let the paperwork do the talking. That turned out to be the best decision I made that entire year. And for the first time in a long time, the house is mine in the only way that really counts. It is mine because the truth says so, and unlike Carl, the truth had the receipts.